So the abortion debate's going pretty strong in the U.S. in terms of what the Supreme Court's discussing. The public, I guess, is discussing it, but they're not really discussing it. Like, it's so rare to come across a comment thread where a pro-life person is engaging a pro-choice person, vice versa, and they're having a kind of cordial enough discussion on their respective views, something that doesn't resemble a flame war, right? It's either the occasional flame war or it's just silo-style discussions, these circle jerks that are just calcifying, especially on this issue. And that's actually resembling exactly opinion polls on the topic of abortion in the US. Because since the 80s onwards, the public has just been stagnant on this. We saw something of an uptick, something of a move toward the pro-choice position around the era of Roe v. Wade. I forget exactly whether that spanned a full decade after, before it stagnated, but it was pretty much a guaranteed statement that from the 90s, early 90s onwards, perhaps mid or late 80s as well, but from the stats I've read, setting aside the questionable status of the 80s, whether there was a kind of moving of the needle, absolutely, from the 90s onwards, in America, just public opinion on abortion, whether we're talking about legally, a legal sense of pro-life versus pro-choice, or just the moral sense of pro-life versus pro-choice, the needle just hasn't moved on that whatsoever. And so I blame advocacy groups for this, because for one, everyone should just understand on so many issues that you're just all wasting money when you pour that much money into a cause. And the abortion groups, pro-life or pro-choice, anti-abortion groups, as well as abortion permissibility groups, there's so much money. I'm going to read out some stats after I do this extemporaneous segment. I'm going to read out some stats in terms of just how much money they've spent on this in terms of activism, to outbid each other, I guess, so as to win the public, to win the messaging. If you just had a kind of activist ceasefire, those unfair style, you can almost view them as hatchet job style approaches to the subject, wouldn't have traveled as much as they did. And so perhaps people wouldn't have just gotten so entrenched, and we would have seen the needle move, because the quality of the discourse would have been better had the quality of the discourse been set by philosophers as opposed to these advocacy groups. Abortion is by no means the only subject that's fallen into that kind of trap, but I think that more than any other subject, I think abortion is probably the top in terms of the central question not even being asked. The central question is not a question of autonomy or when does life begin. The central question of this debate is, when does a person come into existence in the morally relevant sense? And I think we clearly see that when you just look at miscarriages, and there's no outrage anytime, even whether we're talking first trimester, second trimester, when a miscarriage occurs, the couple, the family, well, they don't hold funerals for the subject, for the fetus. They don't hold anything resembling the sort of ceremonies and wakes and sad time commemorations that they do even if their week-old newborn dies. And to say that we're just going to sidestep that lack of activity when it comes to the prenatal subject, fetus, embryo, at whichever stage of the development they are, like I've never seen a funeral for an unborn person, for an unborn fetus. But then you go around using words like children, or we've killed tens of millions, hundreds of millions of children. And that's why America is cursed right now. You hear this sort of stuff increasingly, at least I do. So they're very quick to use the word children. But then, like, why aren't you outraged that when a miscarriage happens, the child never receives a funeral? You're very much outraged when they are murdered, to put your own terms. But it seems to me the sort of person who has already entered existence in the morally relevant sense should have been given a name, should have already had this ID that they have once they are born. And it's just weird that you're only pushing back against the abortion stuff and you're not pushing back on all these other things that aren't being secured for the fetus, or if you want to go back, if you want to be a real zealot about it, at the time of conception. You want to take it back even further. Yeah, I was just, have you ever seen a funeral, like even a couple that is avowedly pro-life, legally, morally, and it's their top-ranked issue, but let's just say that the wife has the miscarriage. Whichever trimester, doesn't really matter. Really, it can happen a week after conception, but let's just be generous and just say that a funeral for a fetus in the second trimester, where the miscarriage occurred. That seems implausible to us, because we don't hold those kinds of firm pro-life views, legally or morally, but I don't see how it's implausible to all the people who do hold those views, who don't hold funerals and wakes and all these other kinds of commemorations, to recognize this unfortunate thing that has happened per their own lights. And see, it just shows that the advocacy groups are the ones pulling the wool over people's eyes. Lowest common denominator is something that's always going to trump analytical style approaches to discussing issues in public affairs when the advocacy groups get involved. And so this is just more than any other issue. We need an activist ceasefire. And philosophers need to call for it more than anyone else. Philosophers with some sort of name recognition, maybe Peter Singer, but Peter Singer is referred to as the most recognizable philosopher of this era, and yet I think I've asked people at my workplace, I can't think of a single one, when I just throw out the name Peter Singer, I can't think of a single one who actually recognized him. And I'm not just asking people in my department, I'm asking people in the nearby departments, whether that's task-related nearby department or actual physical proximity nearby department. And I've asked so many people, either point blank asked them, or I've just thrown out the name Peter Singer, and I can tell based on the reaction that the person doesn't know who I'm talking about. So then I flat out ask, do you know who I'm referring to here? And then they say no, right? And then I'm looking at things like the Great Resignation. And so over the last year and a half, I've really had a chance to screen really, truly that many people on this most recognizable philosopher of the modern age. And I think it's now in the triple digits, given just how many people have come and gone in my department and the nearby departments. And I can't recall a single one who has actually recognized that name. So I understand that what I'm calling for now for philosophers to be in the driver's seat of these heated, I guess, culture war issues, it's asking too much, but that just speaks to the tragedy of our circumstance, even more so. Where the guy who's been billed as the most recognizable philosopher of the era is everything I'm seeing renders him completely unrecognizable. Whereas we need to get to a point where people who are 20 times less recognizable or 30 times less recognizable as him, the expectation should be that even they're recognized by at least people who have these sophisticated jobs and prestigious positions. But we're not even as far along into philosophical progress and philosophical growth where even someone like him is recognized. So, yeah, I'm calling for all these things, and I'm recognizing my own naivete going back a decade and before, because for some reason I thought that the more I get into these things and the more I establish it in my knowledge repertoire, the culture will sooner or later come to follow. And it's just been this last year and a half with the Great Resignation, with this many people quitting and starting again, and that many people coming into contact with me just at work, where I can introduce some subject in an indirect way. It's just been a huge giant slap in the face to see that, no, my assumptions that the culture will eventually catch up, even when it comes to the simple end of things in the philosophical world, the simple things as discussed by someone like Peter Singer, no, they will not catch up even to that. Things will remain unreflective in the world at large. But that still doesn't mean that this is not a reasonable request that I'm making, that the activist ought to do a ceasefire on issue after issue after issue. And that sort of opening can perhaps be filled by philosophers who have taken a more crisp approach to discussing these issues, right? So the fundamental issue with abortion is not the autonomy of the pregnant person, nor is it when does life begin, human life. When does human life begin? It is when does a person enter existence in the morally relevant sense. And an intuition pump that can really drive this home to shed light on the pro-choice position and shed light on what's wrong with the pro-life position, at least when we understand pro-life position as setting its sights on the importance of the fetus in the first and second trimester. Really, you got to just devise a Sophie's Choice style conundrum where the moral agent is confronted with a forced choice, and we can do it in the context of harm prevention, context of beneficence, but something with high stakes. So let's just say that you are standing at this equidistant spot between these two buildings or houses, let's say buildings, both of which are on fire. You're 10 minutes away from both of them, but it's a 10-minute sprint, let's say. And you can't get to both on time. You can get to one just in the nick of time before the fire subsumes the subjects stuck inside. Let's say that the door is jammed from the inside for whatever reason, all the fire exits, but from the outside it can be opened just with a simple turn of the knob by you or whoever else might get there, but let's just say that you have no reason to believe that anyone else will get there. So this fire doesn't look like it's going to be undone anytime soon. The fire extinguishers don't work, so all the people inside are just scrambling inside these two burning buildings. And let's just call them building A, building B. Building A is if you run leftward, building B is if you run rightward. You can't get to both of them. You're going to be exhausted when you get to the first one. You're going to have to sprint for 10 minutes to get to either of them. They're equally far apart from where you're standing right now. And this is not going to work because it's going to seem like a gotcha if you pose this conundrum to a person mid-abortion debate. So I just advise, if you are going to reproduce this type of forced choice when you're discussing a subject with someone, it can't be when the debate is already heated, because then they're going to feel like they've been gotcha'd and they're not going to fess up to what is truly the right answer. But if you just introduce it point blank, if you sneakily incorporate this kind of conundrum, then perhaps you'll have more luck. But the point is, if you run leftward, building A, there you will find 8 individuals. The details of what type of individuals they are doesn't matter, but they are roughly speaking interchangeable. If you run rightward, building B, there's one individual in that building, but it's a prego, and it's a sort of prego that is, let's say, end of first trimester, early second trimester, that sort of range. Or we can go further up, but for the purpose of this specific thought experiment, let's say that's where it is. So there's only one born person. In building B, there's 8 people who are born, and let's say full-fledged adults in building A, but the catch is the prego is pregnant with octuplets. And the way a lot of the strident pro-choice advocates discuss this, like murdering children, even when we're talking about fetuses, this kind of flippant interchangeability between children and fetuses, I just see it all the time, then I really don't see that why would this not be something for which, if they take their own terms seriously, their own terminological forcefulness seriously, like why would it not make more sense to run toward building B? Because there's 9 morally relevant subjects in building B, whereas there's only 8 in building A. And you can get to both buildings just in the nick of time. So there's more. In terms of foreseeable beneficence, there is more to be accomplished for a strident pro-life proponent. And it doesn't even have to go all the way down to policy pro-life. We can just talk about it in terms of these ethical commitments. So a lot of people do have ethical commitments to their pro-life view, but they wouldn't take it so far as to invoke coerciveness to see them realized. Maybe that's because they understand that they understand the issue the way I do legally, or maybe they just understand that there's a lot of methodological problems with that, and that you're going to increase things like back alley abortions and these alternative approaches to that. So the black market is something they might fear. So I'm not giving them immediately credit if they're not legalistic pro-life proponents, and if they're merely moralistic ones. Perhaps there's just these mundane facts that render them unwilling to commit to the legalistic approach. So this kind of forced choice conundrum can apply to them every bit as much. If they're unwilling, if they're going to just tell you point blank, no, I'm going to run toward the building, toward building A, I'm running leftward, I'm sprinting leftward, because there's 8 people. It's like, well, yeah, but by your own lights, there's 9 morally relevant subjects, 1 woman and 8 children, if you want to use the word children, which people do all the time, when it's preceded by the word murder. We've murdered tens of millions, hundreds of millions of children since the 60s. It's like, well, then okay, then I just don't see any room. Literally, I don't see any room. I'm not being hyperbolic. I do not see any room, any justification to run toward saving 8 as opposed to saving 9. And we can tune the dial when it comes to the types of, I mean, really, I can bring it down to as low as 2 people in building A and 1 person in building B, if you want to say that I'm being too sneaky by making it just 8 and 9. Realistically, I know that there's absolutely no reason, even if I just put 2 people in building A and 1 prego pregnant with octuplets in building B. There's still, I'm not just contemplating tossing a coin to figure out where I'm going to go. Clearly, I'm going to go in the direction of the building A. And realistically, if you show me, if you just put 1 person on each side, but you show me that the prego actually has something in the way of a criminal record, so we don't make the potential victims interchangeable in terms of their life histories, like she's some sort of, lengthy record, violent criminality, she's a dark triad type, this lovely cocktail of characterological flaws in the way of psychopathy, Machiavellianism, narcissism, or just a malignant narcissist. But the other one, maybe not a moral saint, but nonetheless does not commit any kind of violent acts throughout their whole life, and is just an ordinary, ordinary type of person. But the prego is pregnant with 8, who will be born in less than a handful of months now. Like even then, I think I can defend forcefully the willingness to run toward the building where the person is not this moral monster, moral reprobate. So that's how I think abortion should be approached, is you gotta get a little innovative, and this seems like it's just a video where I'm chastising the pro-life views. No, there's a lot to chastise in the form of the pro-choice crowds, because they never get innovative. They just double down on these autonomy, a woman's right to choose, a woman's this, a woman's that. And it's just weird in the sense that it's the same coalition that understands that, well, non-women can get pregnant, right? Like trans men can get pregnant. So you gotta even just terminologically shift how you approach this. But I think they still understand that they can get a lot of mileage by saying things like a woman's right to choose. If they took the woman away and incorporated trans men, or just said a person's right to choose, because they're so conceptually anemic, they have no other recourse with which to argue their view. It's just this borderline identity politic, woman's right to choose infused style approach to argumentation. You still hear that from the very people who are very sensitive in terms of recognizing that, well, trans men are real men. They're just like trans women. They insist on convincing all of society that trans women are real women. And so likewise, trans men are real men, and if trans men can get pregnant, then why do we still hear over and over in these debates on abortion, it's about a woman's right to choose? Well, it's kind of passé nowadays. Why haven't you internalized that it's passé if you're raising moral panic after moral panic on the treatment of trans individuals in society? I don't want to litigate that in this video, the trans issue, but I do just find myself increasingly frustrated in terms of how the messaging is not consistent on that. How is that not trans exclusionary when we see people who otherwise are quick to recognize the plight of the trans, and then I think there's a bit of motivated reasoning going on there. It's like, it just wouldn't sound as punchy if we changed a woman's right to choose to an individual's right to choose. There's something where the term woman, it does a lot of work there. So, there's a lot of ire that I can mount that I can deliver on both, but the crux of this video really is this burning building style dilemma. And I know that it's exceedingly rare that someone who actually is committed to any pro-life views is going to stumble upon a video like this. But if you just so happen to have stumbled upon it, tell me which building you'd run to. And if you'd run to building A because it's got 8 subjects, would you still run to building A in place of building B, where the prego with octuplets at the end of first trimester or the beginning of second trimester is stuck? Would you still run toward building A if I just decreased it from 8 individuals to 2 individuals? Or to 1, but then I tune the dial a bit and I make the prego a dark triad style reprobate. In all 3 modified scenarios, I would always run toward building B. Because in all of those cases, the foreseeable weight of the beneficence just absolutely trumps the foreseeable weight of beneficence in opting for building B. I think that's all I have. I'll tack on something else if I can remember it. But yeah, for once, a short video. Amazing! Except I'm going to read a few stats. It was Scott Alexander initially that showed me one of his posts, just how this activist ceasefire thing needs to happen. Because, well, prior to one group making headway in terms of getting all kind of causey, we have a cause and we're going to push our cause, right? They didn't even have their enemies in the way of advocacy groups. So just marginal success translates to a bit more marginal success, translates to you being noticed by the very people who wouldn't have wanted you to have that marginal success, and then they mimic your approach. They have their own advocacy groups, and then it's just this activist arms race. And really, the subject of abortion, I think that really can be linked to the fact that the discourse has not progressed whatsoever. So I'm going to dig up that Scott Alexander blog post, and maybe I was wrong to say that this will be a short video, because maybe I want to read more than a little from that blog post, because those kinds of stats are some of the juiciest stats. And yeah, if you can spread that post to, if you know anyone who's an activist who donates money to their causey causes, you should point them to posts like that show there's just a canceling effect. You have success as an advocate, you're going to be noticed by the very people who don't want you to have success as an advocate, and it's going to spiral. This is a follow-up to what you just saw, and what you just saw was recorded sometime in January, and now we're approaching mid-February, so I've done it again. I've done precisely what I said I tried to stop doing, but I just can't, so I might as well not talk about the fact that I can't do it, and that is follow up things promptly. And I think it's pushing on 4 weeks now since I did that recording, but then at the very end of the recording, I have to say I'm going to tack on some additional stuff in the form of stats. And the thing that I wanted to tack on was the Scott Alexander post where I'm talking about, I briefly referenced it and I wanted to flesh it out more, this issue of lobbyist self-sabotage or activist boosterist self-sabotage, where they just can't see that what they do is going to energize the other side. Now, that's part of the reason why I'm so delayed on this, is because I actually did put in some effort to try to track down that post, searching both Scott's new blog and his old one. And the post seems to have vanished off the face of the earth. So I'm going to stop looking for it, at least for now, and actually do this belated recording that I've had to do for weeks now. Hopefully I will find the motivation to look for it again and to eventually find it so I can read the goods in all their specific glory about how he crunched all this data together, showing how these lobbyists and activists do self-sabotage very often. But right now I cannot unearth that post, and I'm done doing this sort of digital skullduggery to try to find it. I'm done for now. But to make up for that, I'm going to read some other stuff, or at least point people to some other stuff in the form of Pew. So this has a good nifty rundown going in depth about that stagnancy of views on abortion that I mentioned very early on in the video. And no sense in reading it because it's very
you can browse through it very quickly yourself. The part that I do want to read from, just a little bit, is there was this paper that I shared on Community way back in 2019. Now it seems like it was an eternity ago, but it's probably the best paper on abortion, and it looks at it from A to Z. And so I just want to, since I'm not going to be delivering the goods in the form of the Scott Alexander activist stuff, I figured I'd just read a bit of this and then maybe end up reading a bit from Pew, but I don't know, because this is not exactly heavy-duty reading, so I'm going to assume that if anyone's really interested, they can do this. Whereas this paper is glorious, thinking critically about abortion, and I should have returned to it after sharing it on Community about almost 3 years ago at this point, but I never did, and that was a mistake, so I shouldn't have waited for this long until I finally got back to it. Just a couple of highlights from the paper that I think serve as a good appetizer. 3.1, fetal consciousness. The most important information about the development of fetuses is when they become conscious or aware, or when they become able to feel anything. Scientific evidence suggests consciousness likely emerges at the earliest after the first trimester, at least 3 or 4 months into pregnancy. This is controversial in the folk, psychological, and kind of commonsensical corners of the internet discussing abortion, but they never back it up with anything remotely approaching a properly vetted data set. And so if you are swayed by the view that actually this is an incorrect statement, then show me your data, because they supply data right here. To review this research, search the U.S. National Library of Medicine at pubmed.gov for fetal pain and fetal consciousness. Consciousness develops after most abortions occur, so most abortions do not affect conscious feeling fetuses. Another reason this paper is really nifty is it's just not all cold hard text. They've got quite a bit of decent imagery, which we should never underestimate in terms of how some people, it really aids their memory or just their learning per se, is to accompany the argument in its written or oral form with images. I think I even underestimated just how much images do for me in terms of storing information. Maybe not remembering it in the near term, but truly storing it so I can reach back into my mind years later and just uncover it after that much time has passed. It really is the case. I think if I look back, it's truer when it comes to information that I acquire that is partly accompanied by imagery. Concerns about consciousness and feeling in fetuses are most important for them because they are fundamentally what's most important for us. Consciousness enables us to have and experience anything good in life, and it is necessary for anything bad to happen to us also. Without a point of view, things can't get worse for us. So this is all, the important part really was this stuff about the scientific end of things. This can be challenged if you want to get kind of hair-splitty about whether it is exhaustive criteria, but certainly it is kind of, we should all be beyond the point now where we can agree that it is the primary criteria. Whether it is exhaustive of moral considerability is a separate subject, which need not detract from the purpose of the abortion debate and the points I want to make here. When most abortions occur early in the pregnancy, 2/3 in the first 2 months, and around 90% in the first 3 months. The Guttmacher Institute researches these matters and provides this graph. So, nifty graph. I may put this in the thumbnail of the video, but I may put another one in the thumbnail of the video that just shows the stagnancy of how little headway has occurred when it comes to from the time they measured it on these questions of abortion when it comes to the public at large. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control, CDC, also provides research on factual circumstances of abortions, which it presents as abortion surveillance that is readily available online. And I'll link to all this stuff as well because it seems rock solid. I've not seen anyone challenge it. And so it should really it should ground the debate, because the stuff that grounds the debate is things in the way of, it has a heartbeat. and therefore we can infer that it is likely sentient before the first month is up. This is the shit people argue, and it's facepalm inducing. Now, what did I want to do? I wanted one graph from here, but I'm just kind of flying by the seat of my pants. Yeah, I know, I had like 4 weeks to prepare the follow-up section to this video, and yet I am a bit discombobulated. Right, it is this one. Public views of abortion, 1995 through 2021. So they started measuring it in the mid-90s, and I think I recall at the beginning of my video, I was a bit agnostic as to whether the stagnancy kicked in the 80s, but yes, I must have been recalling this specifically. And 60, 59, legal in all / most cases, so 1 point, and then illegal in all / most cases, 38, 39. Minimal. And even the word minimal is probably too kind in terms of just how much stagnancy there has been in the last 2.5 decades. So that's it, and let's see what they say. Nearly 5 decades after the Supreme Court Roe v. Wade decision, opponents and supporters of abortion rights are still battling over the issue in court, at the ballot box, and in state legislatures. Several states have introduced or passed new restrictions on abortion in 2021, with an eye toward giving the Supreme Court a chance to overturn its decision in Roe, and the High Court agreed in May to review a Mississippi law that aims to make most abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy illegal. The case will be the court's first abortion law review since Justice Amy Coney Barrett took the bench in October. As the debate over abortion continues, here are key facts about Americans' views on the topic based on Pew Research Center polls. Around 6 in 10 U.S. adults, 59% say that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. 39% say it should be illegal in all or most cases. According to a survey conducted this spring, though abortion is a divisive issue, about 6 in 10 U.S. adults do not take an absolutist position on abortion. 34% say that it should be legal in most but not all cases, while 26% say it should be legal in most but not all cases. Illegal in most but all cases. Smaller shares take the position that abortion should be either legal 25% or illegal 13% in all cases. Just one more thing before I close this out. In the interest of balance, this paper, Why Abortion is Immoral, I will link this too, because I link the paper that reaches the conclusions I like, so I might as well do something when it comes to polar opposite conclusions. A philosopher I've never heard of. Initially, this was brought to my attention on the Very Bad Wizards podcast. They spoke about this paper glowingly, and it really impressed them. And they seem like they're more than amateurs philosophically, so I was really surprised that this paper impressed them, because there was nothing new here. It's basically making potentiality arguments in a long-winded way. The importance of the future of the subject. All potentiality-imbued futures are morally relevant futures. There, I just saved you 21 pages of... you know what, maybe I'm being too rough. Maybe there was something else here, but I don't think there was. And so, in the interest of 50-50 philosophical papers, I will include this, and maybe you can tell me if you choose to struggle through it, if you choose to waste some time on it. Maybe I missed something about it, but I think on Reddit they actually cleaned it up pretty well. This distills my thoughts on it really well, so I'll just read this paragraph. Also, his argument leads to abstaining from contraception and having as many children as possible, who are also in competition with the parents and each other for resources and happy existences. Markey doesn't do a great job arguing that if an embryo exists and its potential future is stolen, someone is harmed, but if an ovum is discharged, unfertilized, and 1 million sperm thrown in the garbage, no one is harmed. There is not a salient moral difference between a fertilized ovum, blastocytes, embryos, and foiled gametes. All have a potential future. And so you'd think that when something gets name dropped as a as the very bad wizards did. It's like this is something people who think that this issue is not as complicated as it truly is. They're like, you guys got to read this paper. You guys got to read this paper. But at no point does he really anticipate a simplistic, like just ABC level counterpoint right here. And yeah, but apparently it's impressive enough to impress the guys over on Very Bad Wizards. So, and also, I love this. I mean, I love my jargon, but there's certain kind of Latin-friendly jargon that philosophers use that even it can rub even me the wrong way. On first blush does the trick. You don't need to get Latin about it. But I don't think I have a perfectly clean record on that, but I know that at least if I get a little too verbose, it's always with some end in mind, where a simpler term just could not have done the job, which is never the case with this crap. Anyway, that's it.